BIOL 100, Chapter 39, the respiratory system. Okay, so we're going to start off by talking about what gas exchange is and how it's occurring in humans. Your book does talk about some other animals, and they'll be briefly mentioned in this lecture, but it's mostly so that you can appreciate how things have evolved over time, how the respiratory system and breathing and gas exchange has evolved over time. So we know that all cells require oxygen for use in efficient production of energy through the process of cellular respiration. We haven't talked too much about cellular respiration. You'll be hearing a little bit about it throughout the semester. But this is the process in which our body is converting converting food into energy, essentially, and it requires oxygen to do so. So one of the major physiological challenges that faces humans or all multicellular animals is getting enough oxygen and also disposing of carbon dioxide, which is our waste product. So the way we do this is actually between exchanging gases between what are known as alveoli and our blood. So remember the capillaries, those small, thin blood vessels that meet up with our alveoli here, that is where gas exchange occurs. So it happens through diffusion, and it basically is driven by the difference in oxygen and CO2 concentrations on two sides of the membrane. So where there's high concentration, it'll diffuse to low, and doesn't matter what type of gas it is, it'll go high to low, and that's how diffusion works, right? So if we have high O2 in the alveoli, it'll go into the blood. If we have high CO2 into the blood, it'll go into the alveoli. So the opposite is what's occurring in the tissues. So while we're respiring, breathing in and out, this gas exchange is occurring where the oxygen that we're getting from the breath we take is traveling through to the lungs, and then from the lungs we have our high concentration of oxygen, so then that will then diffuse into the blood that's meeting up in those little capillaries next to the alveoli, and the blood would be high in CO2, so that's going to diffuse into the alveoli and then go back out as we respire or exhale. So the rate of diffusion between two regions is governed by something known as Fick's law of diffusion. So you can see R here, the rate of diffusion, is equal to a diffusion constant times the area over which diffusion takes place times the pressure difference between the two sides, and then all of that is divided by the distance over which diffusion occurs. So ideally we want a small distance and a large area between for diffusion to take place. So we usually want to increase like surface area, right? And that means that diffusion can take place at a faster rate, which means that it would be more efficient for us to be exchanging gas molecules. In this case, getting more oxygen into our blood, into our body, so that we can go through cellular respiration and getting rid of all the excess CO2. So there have been some evolutionary changes that have occurred with our rate of diffusion. And again, it's ideally increasing our surface area. So that's why we've developed things like alveoli, which help us increase our surface area. We've decreased the distance that this has to occur over. And we've also increased the concentration difference, where we have a bigger high to low concentration difference than we used to. So, well, not we used to, but evolutionarily this has evolved to increase this concentration difference as well. So these are kind of our ideals in order to get a faster diffusion rate, which is essentially a more efficient diffusion rate. And again, the book talks about some of the other organisms, and you can see as you get more complex, like humans, we require different systems in order to do this. So if we are a unicellular organism, our gases diffuse directly, right? It's really easy, it's very small, it can diffuse very quickly throughout the organism. And small organisms can rely on that direct diffusion. But once you're bigger, you're multicellular, that's when you have to have certain adaptations that will enhance your gas exchange, increase that diffusion rate. So amphibians, for example, can respire across their skin as well as their lungs. Insects have an extensive tracheal system. Fish use their gills. And then as mammals, we have a large network of alveoli within our lung tissue. And that is what increases that surface area and decreases the distance between where our blood is meeting the oxygen coming in through our lungs. So we're not going to talk too much about this, but just know how it's kind of evolved over time and how different it is. If you're really interested in this, there's lots of great videos and resources, but we're just focusing on the human aspect. You'll see it touched on in your book, and also if you watch the Amoeba Sisters video that I posted as well. So just like with lungs increasing surface area in humans, the same happens with fish. That's the reason why they have gills, and their water moves in through their mouth through the gills and then throughout the fish in order to distribute the oxygen. So as we evolved over time, or as evolution occurred, gills were replaced in terrestrial animals by lungs. And lungs help minimize evaporation by moving air through a branched tubular passage. And this tubular passage is covered in mucus, and that prevents direct contact of lung tissue with air. And there's also certain things like cilia that help move that mucus along. You can see here what our lung structure looks like. It's kind of like an upside down tree. Air is passing through us in this direction. So we first inhale air either through our nasal cavity, through our nose, or our oral cavity through our mouth. It's then going to go through the pharynx, which is just above here really, and then into the larynx, which is our voice box, and it's going to make its way into the trachea here. So when you see the trachea, you'll see these little rings on it. These are kind of hard outer rings that are helping the trachea keep its shape and make sure that it doesn't close in on itself. And then from the trachea, we are leading into the primary bronchi. So we're going to split here so that we can go into the right and left lung, essentially. Keep in mind that when we talk about right and left lung, it's respective to your body. So if you pretend like this is your body, this would be your right and this would be your left lung. And also keep in mind that they are not the same size. Your right lung is actually larger. It has 3 lobes, and your left lung is smaller, only contains 2 lobes. Okay, so we first branch off into our bronchi, and we go into the primary bronchi, followed by the secondary bronchi, into the tertiary bronchi, and then leading into the bronchioles. So we're gradually getting smaller here. So we're actually decreasing the area, but increasing our surface area as we get smaller. And as we breathe in, we're exerting a pressure downward due to gravity. So a pressure of 760 milligrams of mercury, mmHg, that's defined as 1 atmosphere of pressure. You might have heard a lot of this talked about if you're into diving, like I'm a diver, right? So we're always talking about pressure differentials and how that affects your body physiologically, whether you're at the surface or if you're at depth. So this is getting into some of that if that's something you're interested in. So 1 atmosphere of pressure is just like if you're on the surface, right? You have literally 1 atmosphere above you of pressure. If you were to go down, say 15 feet into the water, now instead of only having 1 atmosphere, you actually have 2 atmospheres. You double the amount of pressure on your body. Just kind of a side note, if you're interested in snorkeling or diving, since you are living in Hawaii, that is a very common thing here. And so that's kind of getting into this a little bit and talking about different partial pressures, which is just pressure contributed by a gas to the total atmospheric pressure. So we have different partial pressures of different gases that are within the air that we breathe, like oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases that make up the air as well. So these partial pressures are based on the percent of gas in the dry air. So again, at sea level, as we're walking around up on the surface, we have a partial pressure of nitrogen is about 600 millimeters of mercury, oxygen 159, carbon dioxide 0.2. So you can see here it's multiplied by how much of this gas is in the atmosphere or within regular air that we breathe. So air that we breathe is about 79% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, and then the rest of it is, and you can see here, this is usually 78 to 79 and 20 to 21. So the rest of it is made up of other trace gases, including carbon dioxide. If we were to increase in elevation, let's say that we go up volcano or we go up Mauna Kea, then our atmospheric pressure is actually decreasing. We have less atmosphere on top of us, right? So, or let's say we go up to Mount Everest, right? We're at base camp 1. Our atmospheric pressure is actually 401 compared to 760. So it's decreasing instead of increasing. Whereas if we go to depth, if we're going to go dive, it's going to increase. So we can see here our partial pressure of oxygen if we go up to elevation, if we go up to base camp on Mount Everest, if we go up Mauna Kea, whatever it is, we are decreasing our partial pressure of pretty much all gases. But so partial pressure of oxygen now instead, we would be at 84 millimeters of mercury. So the percent of oxygen is actually the same at altitude, right? You have the same amount of oxygen up at top of the Mount Everest as you do down here on the shores of Hawaii, but the partial pressure is lower. So if you've noticed, most people that climb Mount Everest do it with supplemental oxygen, and it's because the pressure differential. So they have to supplement with more oxygen in order to increase that partial pressure back to what it would normally be. If you ever notice, like if you do go to Mauna Kea, if you go to the top, or if you take a trip to mainland and you go up the Rockies or anything like that, if you try running around up there, you'll notice it's a lot harder. And it's because you've decreased the amount of pressure and decreased the partial pressure of important gases like oxygen, making it more difficult for your body to do the work that it would normally do at sea level. Okay, so getting back into how we actually breathe and what's occurring through our respiratory system as we do, our lungs are packed with millions of alveoli. So this is where gas exchange is actually occurring. And you'll see even in the video that I provided, there's a little animation, and the whole respiratory system essentially looks like that upside down tree, right? And then it ends in these little terminal bronchioles that then link up to these alveolar sacs or these alveoli. These guys look like a bunch of grapes essentially. So we have our inhaled air again passing through the larynx, the glottis, and the trachea. And then it's going to bifurcate, which just means separate into right and left bronchi, which then enter each lung and further subdivide into bronchioles. So again, remember we go primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, or bronchus if we're just talking about one. Bronchi is both of them, and then leading into the bronchiole and ending with the terminal bronchiole. And these alveoli are surrounded by an extensive capillary network. Remember when we talked about the circulatory system, capillaries, much like the alveoli, are both very thin-walled, usually only one cell thick. So that means diffusion can occur really quickly. So this is where we want gas exchange to take place. And we have our capillary surrounding our alveolus, which means that it's having to go very little distance for our oxygen and CO2 to exchange back and forth between the blood and our lungs. Just a further example here. So you can see our little grapes at the end of the tree, our alveolar sac, and then the capillaries within it. And you can see here, remember the word pulmonary means that it has to do with lungs. So pulmonary vein is going from the lungs to the heart. Pulmonary artery is going from the heart to the lungs. Remember, blue and red usually represent oxygenated, being red, and blue, or it's almost purplish looking here, being unoxygenated or deoxygenated. So normally when we're coming from the heart, we kind of consider that to be oxygenated, right? But in this case, we're pumping from the heart our deoxygenated blood and we're sending it to the lungs so that it can get oxygenated, because we're pulling oxygen from those capillaries, right? It's going into the capillaries from the alveoli that got oxygen from the air that we breathed, and it went through the whole lung system. Okay, once it's oxygenated, it'll be in these capillaries, and then that'll link up with this pulmonary vein, and that'll go back up to the heart, and then go through the heart and be pumped out to the rest of the body to oxygenate all of our muscles and organs and tissue systems throughout the body. Okay, so during inhalation, what actually happens is your thoracic volume increases by contracting two different muscle sets. So we've got to contract our intercostal muscles, which are kind of in between the rib cage. It doesn't show you the rib cage here, but the rib cage we have over our lungs, and that's to protect them because they're obviously really important. If we puncture a lung, that could be very devastating. So we have our rib cage over our lungs protecting them, and in between our ribs, we have these things called intercostal muscles that allow the rib cage to expand and contract. Our lungs do not do this themselves. They're basically just a balloon that fills up with air or deflates with air. Keep in mind, lungs always have a little bit of air left in them. We don't want to get rid of the air because then the balloon will kind of like stick together, right? So we want to keep a little bit of air in there, as well as something called surfactant, which we'll talk about soon, so that they don't get stuck together and then make it really, really difficult to inflate again. But the way this is happening, that we're breathing in and increasing our thoracic volume. Thoracic just means having to do with the chest. Okay, that's our thoracic cavity. Thoracic cavity is our lungs and rib cage, basically. So that's our thoracic cavity. And we're going to expand the rib cage by contracting those external intercostal muscles that are in between the ribs. And then also the diaphragm, which is underneath our lungs. We call it inferior to our lungs. It's down here. And when we contract that, that expands the volume of the thorax and the lungs as well. This produces a negative pressure, which means that there's less pressure inside of your chest than outside, which means that it's going to draw the air into your lungs. Right. When we're talking about different volumes within the lungs, or if you ever go to the doctor and have to do a test for lung volume, or spirometry is what they usually use, you'll hear a few different numbers told to you. So one is tidal volume. That's the amount of air or the volume of air that's moving in and out of your lungs in a person at rest. So it's what you're breathing in and out. And then you also have something called vital capacity, which is the maximum amount of air that could be expired after a forceful inspiration. So this is like if we're trying to do this, right? So if we're doing spirometry, where we're trying to measure what our total vital capacity is, we're doing this. But when we're taking our normal breaths in and out that are autonomically controlled, they're not voluntary, we're not consciously thinking about our breathing, that's just our tidal volume. And we talked about this a little bit with the circulatory system, but the way that we are carrying oxygen in our blood is through hemoglobin, right? So we've got two alpha and two beta polypeptide chains within the hemoglobin, and each chain is associated with a heme group. And each one of these heme groups has a central iron atom that can bind a molecule of oxygen. Okay, so one hemoglobin can actually bind up to 4 oxygen. And what happens is this hemoglobin loads up with oxygen in the lungs, and it forms what's known as oxyhemoglobin. Remember the oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin, differentiating between our bright red and our darker red blood, our oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. So the reason why a hemoglobin wants to take up oxygen is actually affected by both our pH and our temperature. The pH effect we commonly called the Bohr shift. So what happens is as we increase CO2 in the blood, it increases our hydrogen in the blood, which means when we increase hydrogen, we're actually lowering pH. Okay. So that reduces our hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. So it's not going to be able to bind as much oxygen. So we're actually facilitating oxygen unloading in the tissue by lowering the pH. And if there's high levels of CO2, that means that we need oxygen. So hemoglobin is then going to let go of the oxygen. Increasing temperature also has a similar effect. And in the Amoeba Sisters video, they do a good job of animating the pH effect, the Bohr shift, as well. So I would recommend watching that if this is something that you're having a hard time visualizing. And understanding how our body is controlling the pH within us and keeping it within homeostasis, like our body's happy place, and how that's affected by our respiration. So you can see here our oxygen dissociation curve. So as the partial pressure of oxygen increases, PO2 is down here, partial pressure of oxygen. As that's increasing, we have more oxygen that's binding with hemoglobin. However, you can see the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen may shift to the left or the right depending on environmental conditions. So we can see here this is kind of like an S curve, and we see that it changes depending on if we have lower CO2 or higher pH, a lower temperature, it's going to shift over to the left-hand side. Or if we have a higher CO2, a lower pH, and a higher temperature, we're actually going to shift this over to the right-hand side. So that's a little bit about how hemoglobin is binding to oxygen and delivering oxygen to the body, which then increases or decreases our respiration rate, our heart rate, goes through a whole lot of physiological changes as well. Okay, transportation of carbon dioxide. This is not the same as transporting oxygen. We have about 8% of the CO2 that is in the blood and dissolved within the plasma. And then another 20% of the CO2 in the blood is bound to hemoglobin. So the rest of it is diffused into our red blood cells and then becomes something known as bicarbonate. I'm not going to go into the whole process of how CO2 is carried as bicarbonate, because it starts off as carbonic anhydrase within the red blood cells and then converts into carbonic acid and then dissociates into bicarbonate ions. It's a whole thing. I'm not concerned with you understanding how this chemical reaction is taking place. Just know that the majority of carbon dioxide within our body is carried as part of that bicarbonate buffer system. So again, about 72%, as high as 80%, is in the red blood cells becoming bicarbonate. I'm not too concerned with you understanding the chemistry of that, so don't get too caught up in that within the reading either. Just know roughly how carbon dioxide is carried throughout the body and exchanged throughout the body. Okay, so getting into lung function. So we have hypoventilation, which is not enough breathing, and hyperventilation, which is too much breathing, right? So we are not necessarily controlling our breathing most of the time. It is under autonomic nervous system control, which means that it's happening automatically. We don't have to put much thought into it. Sometimes, obviously, we change our breathing patterns if we're doing meditation, if we're told to be doing spirometry, whatever it is. But hypoventilation is insufficient breathing, and that means that our blood has abnormally high partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Versus hyperventilation is too much breathing, so like panting, and that means that we've got an abnormally low partial pressure of CO2. So our brain isn't signaled to initiate breathing. It basically means that if a person feels like they can't breathe, they're going to start trying to take many shallow breaths, like they can't catch their breath. And then that will eventually add CO2 into the system, triggering the brain to initiate a deep breath. So you'll see like in movies a lot, or sometimes people are asked to breathe into a paper bag to kind of help calm them down. And that's how you kind of get that CO2 back into your system. Our neurons within our nervous system that we'll be talking about in a few weeks here, I think, are really sensitive to blood pressure or to CO2 partial pressure changes within the blood. So a rise will increase the production of carbonic acid, which then lowers the blood pH. So just be concerned with, as CO2 rises in the blood, we are lowering the pH. Right? And then that's going to stimulate chemosensitive neurons within the aortic and carotid bodies. And it's going to send impulses to respiratory control center to increase the rate of breathing. So if we have too much CO2, again, we're going to be increasing the rate of breathing. And then we also have these central chemoreceptors that are sensitive to changes in pH of cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. So depending on the amount of oxygen or carbon dioxide in your blood, that can determine how quickly or how slowly you are breathing, whether it goes into hypoventilation or hyperventilation. Okay, respiratory diseases. So you are doing a forum on respiratory diseases, and there are quite a few of them. We're mentioning COPD here, asthma, emphysema, but there's also things like cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease, and that's where mucus is essentially, you have too much of a buildup of mucus. So we didn't talk about it too much in this lecture, although it is mentioned in your reading and in the video that you're watching. But as we breathe in air through our nose or our mouth, and it's going through the whole system into the larynx or pharynx, larynx, and trachea, we have mucus lining that area that's essentially helping take out particles that we don't want from the air, right? And then we eventually either bring those back up and swallow them down our esophagus, which is a different tube leading into our digestive tract, or we cough them up, or we sneeze, we blow our nose, whatever it is. And all of that mucus and cilia, which are like hair-like structures, that moves all of it out, right? And we need mucus. That's a protective measure for our respiratory system. But if we have too much of it, that's when we run into issues with our lungs becoming less elastic, with our lungs not being able to move in the right way. They're basically being weighed down. So cystic fibrosis is like a big buildup of mucus. And you'll see in cystic fibrosis patients, a lot of times what they have to do is they have to wear this vest that like vibrates them. And it essentially vibrates their lungs to kind of break up that mucus and try to move it throughout the body. And it's a really, really harsh disease. But we also have COPD, which is any disorder that can obstruct airflow on a long-term basis. Asthma, a lot of you are probably familiar with asthma. I have asthma, and it's when allergens trigger the release of a histamine, and it causes this intense constriction of the bronchi and sometimes even suffocation if you're having a really bad asthma attack. And asthma can be triggered by lots of different things. Like my asthma doesn't usually act up unless there's fog, right? And I have different allergies to different things. If they become really excessive, then I might have a trigger in asthma. Emphysema is when your alveolar walls break down and the lung exhibits larger but fewer alveoli, so the lungs become less elastic. And most of the deaths that occur with emphysema are usually caused by cigarette smoking, because when you smoke cigarettes, the walls of the alveoli are destroyed, so you are actually decreasing the surface area for gas exchange. And there's lots of other things that happen when you're smoking, like you're killing off a lot of those cilia cells, and so you're not able to move that mucus around, and that mucus just gets caught up in your airway, which is why you hear lots of people that have like a smoker's cough, right? Because they've essentially destroyed some of that cilia and mucus layer within their upper respiratory tract, and they're just trying to cough it up all the time because there's nothing else that they can really do about it. It's not moving the way that it would in a normal person's respiratory tract. Other respiratory diseases, lung cancer has more deaths than any other form of cancer. I don't know if this is actually true anymore. I'd have to look at that again. So if you're doing lung cancer, maybe double check that. But lung cancer is usually caused by cigarette smoking. Again, it's not the only way that you can get lung cancer. Sometimes it's just unfortunately luck of the draw. But you can see a lung here affected by lung cancer. This is a smoker's lung as well. And usually it follows or accompanies the COPD as well. And lung cancer can metastasize or spread so rapidly that it's usually invaded other organs by the time it's diagnosed, which is one of the reasons why it is really deadly. And your chance of recovering from that is not very good. Only 3% of patients surviving for 5 years after diagnosis. And again, if you're doing lung cancer as part of your forum, please double check some of these because some of them might be a little bit outdated, but it's still pretty close. It still is very much a deadly disease that can be pretty hard to diagnose in early years, unfortunately. And so it does take a tough toll on the body. But there are many other respiratory diseases that you can talk about. In addition, we talked about some of the obstructive diseases here, like emphysema, asthma, pulmonary edema, even you can talk about lung cancer. You also see respiratory distress syndrome in babies that are born prematurely because as you're developing as a baby, you're producing more surfactant. And again, surfactant it kind of works like a detergent. So it helps reduce surface tension and allows for easier inflation of your airways. So again, like if you're thinking of the lungs as a balloon, if you completely deflate that balloon, it's going to take quite a bit of energy to reinflate it, right? And what surface tension does is even if you deflate it most of the way, it's like a detergent that's within the balloon so that you don't need as much effort or work to begin to inflate it. And then as it's decreasing, it's still easier to blow it back up. So a small amount of surfactant in the airway tissues is helping to reduce the amount of work that you have to do. So if you're born prematurely, you probably don't have enough surfactant, and so it requires more effort to inflate your lungs as a premature baby. And it also helps prevent collapsing of small alveoli relative to large alveoli. So this is a problem, and it's actually kind of cool because in recent years they've actually developed a surfactant. Now that they're aware of it, they can help out these premature babies a lot quicker rather than having to keep them in the NICU for so long on different respirator things within the hospital, essentially to help them make sure that they're getting enough oxygen into their system. So lots of different diseases you can talk about, all the way from preemie babies to adulthood, and different things that could be either genetic or caused by environmental factors like smoking. So keep those in mind when you're talking about these topics and understand how these are affecting the respiratory system, whether it's the actual process of breathing, whether it's getting oxygen into your system, expelling CO2. There's different diseases that do different things within the respiratory system and often lead to very similar results. But keep those in mind when you go to write both your response and your initial post as well.